She paused halfway up the stairs, wondering when effort became something you noticed. The morning light slipped through the narrow kitchen window the way it always had, landing on the edge of the counter and warming the ceramic mug in her hands. Nothing about the scene was dramatic. No alarms, no sharp pain, no sudden event that would make a good story later. Just an ordinary Tuesday, in a quiet American house, where the clock ticked a little louder than it used to. She had lived in this house for 27 years, long enough to know every creak in the floor, every stubborn cabinet hinge, every stair that dipped slightly in the middle. Those stairs had never asked anything of her before. They were just there, a path between coffee and laundry, between morning and afternoon. Today, though, she stopped halfway up. Her fingers curled around the wooden rail, smooth from decades of use. She told herself she was just catching her breath. She told herself the mug had been heavier than expected, that she should have finished the coffee downstairs. Small excuses arrived easily. They always do. What lingered was the pause. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the quiet awareness of effort. The kind that slips in unnoticed, then stays. She stood there long enough to hear the refrigerator hum below her, long enough to feel the faint pull in her calves, long enough to think, almost absently, I don't remember when this started. Her name was Margaret, though most people called her Maggie. 62, recently retired, the kind of woman who still folded towels into precise rectangles and wrote grocery lists in cursive. She had raised 2 kids in this house, hosted Thanksgivings that spilled into the living room, danced barefoot in the kitchen more than once when the radio surprised her with an old favorite. She had always trusted her body. Not in a dramatic way, not like athletes talk about trust. Just the quiet confidence that if she asked it to do something, carry groceries, chase a toddler, climb a flight of stairs, it would respond without negotiation. Standing there, one hand on the rail, she felt that trust hesitate. Later, she would struggle to describe this moment if someone asked. There was no single thought that landed like a verdict. Instead, there was a feeling, soft but persistent, like noticing a room had grown dimmer without remembering anyone touching the lights. She finished the climb, of course. She always did. The laundry still needed doing. Life, as it tends to, kept moving. But something had shifted, just enough to be noticed. As she sorted clothes that morning, she found herself remembering a different set of stairs. The ones at her parents' house in Ohio, narrow and steep, where she used to take them 2 at a time. She remembered laughing as her mother scolded her from the kitchen, warning her she'd fall one day if she didn't slow down. Slow down, she thought now, folding a faded t-shirt. It was strange how advice waits decades to make sense. In the mirror above the washer, she caught her reflection without trying. Same face, mostly. The fine lines felt familiar, earned. What surprised her was not how she looked, but how she felt behind the eyes, slightly foggy, slightly heavy, as if her thoughts were moving through thick air. Many people notice things like this and brush them aside. A bad night's sleep. Too much salt. Not enough water. Maggie had done that too. More times than she could count. She wasn't someone who worried easily. Worry felt like wasted energy, and energy, she had learned, was something you didn't want to waste. Still, the morning stayed with her. At breakfast, she sat longer than usual, spoon resting in the bowl, listening to the distant sound of a neighbor starting their car. According to many studies, mornings often reveal how the body is doing better than any checklist ever could. Maggie didn't know the studies. She just knew how she felt. She thought about calling her daughter, then decided against it. There was nothing to report, no story worth telling. And yet, a quiet question had begun to form, one she didn't quite have words for yet. What if this isn't just getting older? What if it's something smaller, subtler, easier to overlook? Later that day, she drove to the grocery store, the radio murmuring softly. She watched people move through the aisles, some fast, some slow, all of them carrying their own private calculations about energy and time. She noticed how many faces looked tired in the same gentle way. She felt tired, not exhausted, just weighed down. It struck her then how rarely people talk about this part of aging. Not illness, not crisis, just the gradual accumulation of small discomforts that don't seem important enough to name, yet quietly shape how you move through the day. In the produce section, she picked up an apple and turned it in her hand. firm, unremarkable, dependable. She smiled at the thought that bodies, like fruit, change from the inside long before anything obvious shows on the surface. It wasn't a scientific thought, just an observation, the kind that comes when you finally slow down enough to notice. That night, as she climbed the stairs again, she paid attention, not with judgment, but curiosity. Her foot met each step. Her breath rose and fell. She reached the top and felt a small, almost silly sense of relief. Nothing was wrong. Maggie would not have said this out loud, but a quiet resolve had begun to take shape. Not a plan, not a promise, just a willingness to notice, to treat these small signals not as inconveniences, but as information. There's a certain wisdom that arrives when you realize your body isn't an obstacle to overcome, but a companion that has been with you longer than anyone else. It doesn't shout, it whispers, and it's easy to miss if you're always rushing past the sound. She turned off the light, the house settling around her, and thought, maybe this is how change actually begins. Not with fear, just with attention. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I don't remember feeling this heavy, she thought, standing still for no clear reason. The comment surprised her by how quietly it arrived. It wasn't dramatic, not something she would ever say out loud. It floated up while she was waiting for the kettle to boil, staring at the small crack in the wall above the stove she'd meant to fix for years. Heavy wasn't the right word, exactly. It was closer to dense, like her body had absorbed something invisible overnight. Maggie pressed her palm flat against the counter and leaned forward just a little. The kettle hadn't started whistling yet. Time stretched in that ordinary way it does when nothing urgent is happening. She felt fine, truly. And yet, she felt slower, as if there were a fraction of a second between deciding to move and actually moving. She remembered a morning, years ago, when she'd woken up before dawn to drive her son to a swim meet. She had moved through the kitchen half asleep, still light on her feet, tying her shoes while drinking coffee, laughing at his nerves. Her body had followed her intentions without delay back then. No negotiation, no pause. That memory didn't make her sad. What it stirred was confusion. At the table, she wrapped both hands around her mug, feeling the heat seep into her fingers. According to many studies, people often first notice changes not during big moments, but during the pauses between them. Maggie wouldn't have phrased it that way. She just knew that something about stillness made things clearer. She took a sip and noticed how full she felt already, despite having eaten lightly the night before. It wasn't discomfort, just a sense of fullness that lingered longer than she expected. She shrugged it off, the way most people do. Bodies are complicated, days are inconsistent. You learn not to read too much into one sensation, but it wasn't just one. Later that morning, she decided to clean out the hall closet. It was the kind of task she usually enjoyed, simple, finite, a visible result at the end. She pulled out coats she hadn't worn in years, scarves that still smelled faintly of old perfume, a pair of boots she kept meaning to donate. Halfway through, she sat down on the floor without planning to. Her knees didn't hurt, her back didn't complain, she just felt spent, the kind of tired that doesn't come from effort, but from accumulation. She laughed softly at herself, shaking her head. "You're being dramatic," she said to no one. The house didn't answer. As she sat there, surrounded by the small artifacts of past seasons, she noticed something else. Her thoughts felt less sharp. Not dull, exactly just slower to line up. It reminded her of trying to remember a word that stays just out of reach, not gone, just delayed. Many people notice this and never mention it. It feels too vague to explain, too minor to complain about. Maggie had always been practical. You don't make a fuss without a reason. And she didn't have one. Not a concrete one. In the afternoon, she drove to meet a friend for lunch. They sat by the window, sunlight spilling across the table, talking about grandchildren, travel plans that might happen someday, the price of groceries. Maggie listened more than she spoke, nodding at the right moments. She felt present, engaged, and yet, beneath the conversation, there was that same subtle weight, like wearing a sweater you don't remember putting on. When her friend asked how retirement was treating her, Maggie smiled. "Good," she said, because it was true. She had time now, space, fewer obligations. What she didn't say was that time, it turned out, made certain things harder to ignore. On the drive home, she turned the radio off. Silence felt easier. She noticed how her shoulders relaxed when there was nothing to process, nothing to respond to. It made her wonder just briefly how much effort her body had been quietly spending on things she used to do without thinking. That evening, she pulled out an old photo album. It wasn't intentional. She had been looking for a warranty and got distracted, which seemed to be happening more often lately. She sat on the couch, flipping through glossy pages filled with birthdays, vacations, ordinary days that had once felt important enough to capture. In one photo, she was standing on a beach, hair windblown, laughing at something just outside the frame. She remembered that day clearly. She remembered how easy it felt to move through the sand, how her body had felt like part of the landscape instead of something she had to manage. She studied the image, not with longing, but curiosity. What had changed, really? Not her age, that was obvious, but something quieter, something internal. According to many studies, the body adapts constantly, adjusting to routines, habits, and rhythms over time. Maggie didn't think in terms of adaptation. She thought in terms of listening, and she realized she hadn't been listening much at all. She had been busy being capable. That night, lying in bed, she noticed how long it took to get comfortable. Not uncomfortable, just unsettled. She shifted once, then again, until finally she lay still, staring at the ceiling fan, tracing slow circles in the dark. A thought crossed her mind then, gentle but persistent. What if this heaviness isn't a problem to solve, but a message? It wasn't a frightening thought. It was oddly calming, as if naming the question made space for an answer to arrive later, on its own time. Maggie closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, feeling her chest rise and fall. She wasn't looking for change yet, just clarity, just understanding. Sometimes, she realized, the body doesn't break down. It speaks up, and the real question is whether you're willing to hear it before it has to raise its voice. Have you ever noticed how a quiet feeling can ask the loudest questions? The sink was full, and so was her mind. Warm water rushed over her hands as Maggie stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves pushed up, the late afternoon light slanting across the countertop. Plates clinked softly as she stacked them, one by one, moving at a pace that felt unhurried but deliberate. She had nowhere else to be. And yet, she felt the familiar tug of distraction, the sense that her thoughts were drifting somewhere just out of reach. The sink had filled faster than she remembered. She frowned slightly, not because it mattered, but because it caught her attention. She rinsed a bowl and set it in the rack, noticing how her stomach felt fuller than it should have after such a simple lunch. Not uncomfortable. Just present, as if it hadn't gotten the memo that the meal was over. She rested her hip against the counter and exhaled. It was a strange thing, noticing your own body this way. Maggie had spent most of her life moving through days without much commentary. Hunger came, hunger went. Energy rose, energy faded. Now, the sensations seemed to linger, like guests who stayed a little too long after dinner. She remembered her mother, standing at a sink, just like this one, humming softly, pausing now and then to press a hand against her lower back. At the time, Maggie had assumed it was simply age, a single word that explained everything without asking for details. Now she wasn't so sure. As she scrubbed the last pan, she caught herself thinking about how often she'd felt off lately without being able to explain why. A touch of fog in the mornings, a heaviness after meals, a sense that her body was holding on to things longer than it used to, not just food, but fatigue, tension, even moods. Many people notice this and never connect the dots. The sensations are too mild to demand attention, too common to feel unique. Maggie had certainly never brought them up in conversation. It felt indulgent, somehow, to talk about feelings that didn't have names. She turned off the faucet and stood there for a moment, hands dripping, listening to the house settle into its afternoon quiet. The refrigerator clicked on. A bird tapped briefly at the window, then disappeared. Her thoughts drifted to something she'd read months ago and promptly forgotten, about digestion being less like a straight line and more like a rhythm. Not a machine that finishes one task and moves neatly to the next, but a system that responds to timing, stress, rest. At the time, She'd skimmed past it, and, now, it floated back with surprising relevance. According to many studies, as people get older, the body becomes more sensitive to patterns. How often you eat, how quickly you move, how much you rest. Maggie didn't know the science behind it. She didn't need to. She could feel the truth of it in small, ordinary moments like this one. She dried her hands and walked to the window, watching a neighbor load groceries into their car. Everything looked normal from the outside. That thought made her smile. So much of life looks normal from the outside. Later, she sat down with a cup of tea and opened a notebook she usually reserved for shopping lists. On a blank page, without much intention, she wrote a few words. When how, feels full longer. Slower in the mornings, heavy after eating. She stared at the list, surprised by how gentle it felt to put these things on paper. There was no diagnosis here, no worry, just observation. This, she realized, was what she'd been missing. Not a solution, but permission to notice without judgment, to be curious instead of concerned. It felt like standing in a room and finally opening a window, letting fresh air in without rearranging the furniture. That evening, she cooked something simple. Soup, mostly vegetables, the kind her mother used to make when no one felt particularly hungry but everyone needed to eat. She ate slowly, seated at the table instead of standing at the counter. Halfway through, she paused, not because she was full, but because she was paying attention. The soup tasted good. Better than she expected. She noticed how warmth spread through her chest, how the tightness she hadn't realized was there began to ease. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't feel like a fix. It felt like alignment. As she washed the bowl afterward, the sink was nearly empty. She smiled at the small symmetry of it. That night, lying in bed, Maggie thought about how often people talk about health in extremes before and after, sick and well, broken and fixed. Rarely do they talk about the middle, the long stretch where the body is simply adjusting, asking for small accommodations, offering quiet feedback. There was something comforting in that idea. She didn't fall asleep with a plan. She fell asleep with a question, one that felt lighter than the ones she'd been carrying before. What if the answers aren't hidden at all, but waiting in the everyday moments we usually rush through? Have you ever noticed how ordinary routines can reveal what we've been overlooking? It wasn't breaking down. She realized it was trying to keep up. Maggie noticed it first in the garage, of all places. She had gone out to grab a box of old holiday decorations, the kind labeled in fading marker and stacked with the optimism of someone who assumed lifting would always feel the same. As she bent to pull one toward her, she paused, not because she couldn't lift it, but because she felt the familiar calculation begin in her body. How much effort would this take? How careful should she be? She straightened up slowly and smiled to herself. It was an odd thing, this new habit of negotiating with her own movements. She wasn't injured. Nothing hurt. Naktakta stated, mastering that, hersen.com, part of IRS, and by, and her you, wasn't injured. But everything seemed to require a brief internal check, like turning the key in a car and waiting a beat longer for the engine to catch. That image stayed with her as she carried the box inside. The body, she thought, isn't a machine that suddenly fails. It's more like an engine that's been running faithfully for decades. Over time, it doesn't stop working, it just needs different care, different timing, different fuel. In the kitchen, she set the box down and leaned against the counter, letting the thoughts settle. According to many studies, the systems that manage energy, digestion, and recovery tend to slow subtly with age. Not in a way that announces itself, but in ways that ask for adjustment. Maggie didn't think of it as decline. She thought of it as recalibration. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly, noticing how often she rushed these small acts without realizing it. It struck her that she'd spent years optimizing her schedule, getting more done in less time without ever asking whether her body still wanted to play by those rules. When she was younger, her days had been packed tight. Meals squeezed between meetings. Sleep treated like a negotiable item. Her body had adapted, the way bodies do. It learned to run on less, to hold on to reserves, to manage stress quietly in the background. Now, with fewer demands, those old adaptations seemed to linger. Like a pantry stocked for emergencies that never came, everything felt a little stored. The thought made her laugh softly. She pictured her body as a kitchen where no one had cleaned out the cabinets in years. Not dirty, just full, too full to work efficiently. Simple science, she realized, doesn't have to be complicated to be useful. Many people observe that when the body is under constant pressure, rushing, skipping rest, eating on the go, it adjusts by slowing certain processes, conserving energy where it can. Over time, those adjustments become habits. The body doesn't know when the emergency is over unless you show it. Maggie sat at the table and traced a small scratch in the wood with her fingertip. This wasn't about blame, it was about understanding, about recognizing that her body had been doing its best with the information it had been given. She thought back to the years when she'd eaten dinner standing up, when stress had felt like a normal part of success. At the time, she'd been proud of how much she could handle, and she had handled it. Her body had carried her through every season, every demand. Maybe now, it was asking for something in return. Later that afternoon, she took a short walk around the block. Not for exercise, not to hit a goal, just to move. She noticed how her steps felt more natural when she didn't rush them, how her breathing settled when she let the pace find her instead of forcing it. According to many studies, gentle, consistent movement helps remind the body that it's safe to let go of old patterns of holding and conserving. Maggie didn't know the mechanisms. She just knew she felt better when she stopped trying to outrun herself. As she passed a neighbor tending their garden, she waved and slowed to exchange a few words. The conversation was ordinary, pleasant, unremarkable, and yet, she felt lighter afterward, as if connection itself had eased something inside her. Back home, she brewed tea and sat by the window, watching the afternoon fade. The house felt calm, and for the first time in a while, so did she. Not energized, not transformed, just aligned. There was a quiet relief in realizing that nothing had gone wrong, that her body wasn't failing her. It was communicating in the only language it had: sensation, timing, rhythm. A thought surfaced then, one that felt like a small piece of wisdom she might have once dismissed. You don't punish an old engine for running slower. You learn how to care for it better. That night, as she prepared for bed, Maggie felt a subtle shift. Not in her body, exactly, but in her relationship to it. The heaviness she'd been noticing no longer felt like a threat. It felt like information. And information, she realized, is a gift if you're willing to receive it. Have you ever noticed how understanding something can change how it feels? Everything looks mostly normal, the doctor said, then turned to the screen. Maggie sat on the edge of the exam table, paper crinkling beneath her, her feet dangling slightly above the floor. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something floral meant to soften it. She watched the doctor's reflection in the computer monitor as he scrolled, nodded, clicked. Mostly normal. The words landed gently, the way they always did. They were meant to reassure, and in many ways, they did. Blood pressure fine. Numbers within range. Nothing alarming. Maggie smiled and thanked him, because that's what you do when you're told there's nothing to worry about. Still, as she walked out to the parking lot a few minutes later, the phrase echoed in her mind with unexpected weight. Mostly normal, left a lot of space. She sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel. The sun was bright, the day clear. By all visible measures, she was healthy. And yet, the quiet questions she'd been carrying hadn't gone anywhere. On the drive home, she thought about how often people confuse reassurance with resolution. According to many studies, routine checkups are designed to catch problems, not explain subtleties. Maggie didn't begrudge that. She was grateful, truly. But gratitude didn't erase the feeling that something important had been left unspoken. At home, she placed the paperwork on the kitchen counter and went about her day. She answered an email she'd been putting off, watered the plants, folded laundry with her usual care. Life resumed its steady rhythm, and from the outside, everything looked exactly the same. Inside, though, there was a quiet disconnect. She noticed it when she bent to pick up a basket, and felt that familiar hesitation. When she sat down in the afternoon, and felt more tired than the tasks seemed to justify. When her thoughts drifted mid-sentence, like a radio briefly losing signal. None of it rose to the level of complaint. None of it fit neatly into a form. Later, she called her sister. They talked about practical things, family updates, weekend plans, a recipe neither of them ever followed exactly. Maggie mentioned the appointment in passing. "Everything okay?" her sister asked. "Yeah," Maggie said, "all normal." She paused, then added, "Mostly." They laughed, but the word lingered. That evening, Maggie took a walk as the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with pale orange and gray. She passed houses where lights flickered on one by one, each window holding a private world. She wondered how many people inside those houses had been told the same thing she had. Mostly normal. According to many studies, people often experience changes that don't show up in standard tests. Shifts in energy, comfort, clarity. Maggie didn't feel dismissed by the doctor. She felt something more complicated, seen, but not entirely understood. And maybe that wasn't anyone's fault. Back home, she sat at the table with her notebook. The one that had started as a place for lists and had quietly become something else. She wrote the words again, slower this time. Mostly normal. Then, beneath it, she added another line. But I don't feel like myself. The honesty of it surprised her. It felt vulnerable, almost indulgent, but also relieving. Like admitting you're tired after insisting all day that you're fine. She didn't expect answers to appear on the page. She just wanted to close the gap between what the numbers said and what her body was experiencing. Between reassurance and understanding. As she closed the notebook, a thought settled in that felt steadier than the others. Health, she realized, isn't just the absence of something wrong, it's the presence of something right. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt less anxious than she had after the appointment. Naming the space between normal and well had softened it. She wasn't broken, she wasn't imagining things, she was simply paying attention to layers that don't always show up on screens. Sometimes, she thought, the most important conversations don't happen in exam rooms. They happen quietly afterward, when you finally allow yourself to ask a different kind of question. Have you ever noticed how reassurance can still leave room for curiosity? The walk felt longer than it should have. Maggie stepped out onto the sidewalk just after lunch, the air cool enough to feel clean in her lungs. She'd walked this route hundreds of times, a gentle loop around the neighborhood, past the same maple tree with the crooked trunk, past the blue house with the wind chimes that never quite stayed quiet. It was a walk she didn't have to think about. Today, she was thinking about it. Her pace was steady, not slow, but she noticed the effort behind it. The way her arms felt heavier as they swung. The way her breathing needed a moment to settle. When she reached the small incline near the end of the block, none of it stopped her. None of it hurt. It simply made itself known. She smiled wryly at the thought. You're walking, she told herself. Not climbing a mountain. Not climbing a mountain. But that was the thing. Walking had always been the easy part. As she moved, she paid attention to the rhythm of her steps, how each foot met the ground. According to many studies, people often sense changes in mobility, not as loss, but as increased awareness. Maggie felt that now, a heightened consciousness of something that had once run on autopilot. She passed a young couple pushing a stroller, their conversation animated, their movements quick and unguarded. For a fleeting moment, she remembered when walking had felt like that, unexamined, effortless. The memory didn't sting. It just floated by, like a leaf on water. Halfway through the loop, she slowed and stopped near a bench she'd never really noticed before. She sat, resting her hands on her knees, watching the world continue without her for a minute. A dog tugged eagerly at its leash. A delivery truck idled at the curb. Life moved on, indifferent to her pause. The rest felt good. She took a few deep breaths, feeling her chest expand, then settle. It occurred to her that she rarely let herself stop without a reason. Stopping felt like giving in, like admitting something she wasn't ready to name. But sitting there, she didn't feel defeated. She felt thoughtful. Many people notice that movement changes, not just the body, but the mind. When she stood again and resumed walking, her steps felt lighter, not because anything had changed physically, but because she had released the urgency to perform the walk a certain way. Back home, she leaned against the counter and drank a glass of water, noticing how thirsty she was. It made her wonder how often she'd ignored small signals, assuming they were background noise instead of information. In the afternoon, she folded laundry and listened to the radio, the volume low. She noticed how her attention drifted less when she wasn't pushing herself, how her body responded better to invitation than demand. According to many studies, gentle movement supports balance and confidence, especially when paired with rest. Maggie didn't think of it as exercise science. She thought of it as courtesy, treating her body with the same patience she offered everyone else. Later, she called her daughter and mentioned the walk. Not the heaviness, not the pause on the bench, just the fact that she'd enjoyed being outside. "That's good," her daughter said. "You always feel better when you get some air." Maggie agreed. But privately, she knew it wasn't just the air. It was the permission to adjust, to meet herself where she was, instead of where she thought she should be. As evening approached, she took a shorter walk, just to the end of the driveway and back. It felt oddly satisfying, like choosing exactly what you need instead of what you're supposed to want. A quiet thought surfaced then, one that felt less like advice and more like truth. Movement doesn't have to prove anything to be meaningful. That night, her legs felt pleasantly tired, not heavy. She slept more soundly than she had in days, her body responding to the simple message that it was safe to slow down. Change, she realized, doesn't always announce itself with big moments. Sometimes it shows up as a longer walk, a shorter one, or the freedom to choose between the two. Have you ever noticed how listening to your body can change the way you move through the day? The soil wouldn't drain, no matter how much she watered it. Maggie knelt in the garden, the damp earth pressing cool against her palms. The raised bed had been her project since retirement, a modest rectangle of tomatoes, herbs, and whatever else caught her eye at the nursery. She liked the ritual of it, the early mornings, the quiet focus, the sense that tending something living also tended something in her. Today, though, something was off. She poured water slowly at the base of a tomato plant and watched it pool on the surface, stubborn and glossy, refusing to sink in. She frowned and tried again, this time moving the soil gently with her fingers. The water still lingered, trapped above ground. "Well," she said softly, "that explains a few things." She sat back on her heels and studied the bed. The plants weren't dead, they weren't even struggling, exactly. They just weren't thriving the way they should have been by now. The leaves were a touch dull, the growth slower than she remembered from past summers. It wasn't a lack of care. It was something underneath. As she worked a small trowel into the soil, she found the problem earth packed too tightly over time, compacted by seasons of watering and weather. Nothing dramatic, just gradual compression that made it hard for water and air to move where they were needed. The realization landed with unexpected familiarity. According to many studies, systems work best when there's flow, whether it's soil, traffic, or the body's internal processes. Maggie didn't need research to feel the truth of that. She'd been sensing it in herself for weeks now. The heaviness, the lingering fullness, the sense that things weren't moving through her the way they used to. She loosened the soil carefully, lifting and turning it without tearing the roots. The work was slow, deliberate. She paused often, not out of fatigue, but respect. You can't rush something that needs space. As she worked, her mind wandered to how she'd treated her own routines over the years. Meals eaten quickly. Stress packed down by habit. Rest postponed. None of it intentional. Just layers added, one on top of another, until everything was a little too dense. It struck her then that the problem wasn't that her body was failing. It was that it had adapted to pressure for so long, it hadn't been given a reason to let go. She stood and stretched, hands on her lower back, breathing in the green, earthy scent of the garden. Many people notice that when they slow down enough to observe, patterns start to reveal themselves. Maggie felt that now, not as a revelation, but as a quiet alignment of thoughts and experience. She fetched a small bag of compost and worked it into the bed, lightening the soil, giving it texture again. When she watered this time, the water disappeared almost immediately, soaking in as if the ground had been waiting for permission. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. That evening, she made dinner with the same care. She chopped vegetables slowly, noticed how she felt while eating instead of rushing through it. She stopped when she was satisfied, not when the plate was empty. It felt less like discipline and more like courtesy. According to many studies, small, consistent shifts, slowing meals, choosing simpler foods, allowing time between can influence how comfortable people feel day to day. Maggie didn't frame it as a strategy. She framed it as an experiment, guided by observation rather than expectation. After dinner, she stepped outside again, checking the garden one last time. The soil looked darker now, softer. The plants stood quietly, unchanged for the moment, but somehow more promising. She thought about how often people expect immediate results, in gardens and in bodies, how easily we forget that preparation happens long before growth becomes visible. A gentle piece of wisdom surfaced, one she felt rather than articulated. Sometimes thriving isn't about adding more, it's about making room. As night settled in, Maggie felt a subtle ease in her own body. Not dramatic, not complete, but noticeable, like something had been loosened, given space to move. She washed her hands, the dirt swirling down the drain, and felt a quiet satisfaction in the simple symmetry of it. Have you ever noticed how what's underneath matters more than what you see on the surface? She didn't make a big decision, just a small one. Maggie stood in the grocery store aisle longer than usual, staring at two nearly identical cans of soup. It wasn't the labels that held her attention, it was the unfamiliar feeling of pause. In the past, she would have reached automatically, grabbed what she always did, and moved on. Today, she hesitated not out of confusion, but intention. She chose the simpler one. Fewer ingredients she couldn't pronounce. Nothing radical, just different enough to notice. On the drive home, she thought about how change is usually portrayed as a grand moment, an announcement, a vow, a clean break from the old way of doing things. Her life had never worked like that. Most of what mattered had shifted quietly, through repetition rather than resolve. At home, she unpacked the groceries slowly, setting items on the counter as if arranging thoughts. She noticed how many of her usual choices had been made out of habit rather than preference. It wasn't that they were wrong. They were just inherited from a version of herself who lived at a different pace. According to many studies, the body responds best to consistency, not intensity. Maggie liked that idea. It felt forgiving. It meant she didn't have to overhaul her life to feel better, just adjust the rhythm. That afternoon, she decided to eat lunch earlier than usual. Not because she was hungry, but because she was listening. She made something modest, sat at the table, and put her phone in the other room. The silence felt strange at first, then comforting. Halfway through the meal, she noticed something subtle. She felt satisfied. Sooner. Not full. Not heavy. Just done. She wrapped the leftovers and smiled at the small victory, if it could even be called that. Later, instead of tackling a long list of errands, she chose one. Just one. The rest could wait. The choice didn't feel lazy. It felt respectful. In the early evening, she took another walk, shorter than the one from the day before, and slower. She stopped to watch the sky change colors, something she'd rarely allowed herself time for. The pause felt nourishing in a way she hadn't expected. Many people notice that when they stop forcing progress, progress shows up differently. Maggie felt that now, not as a surge of energy but as a reduction in resistance. Her body seemed less guarded, less braced. She thought back to her garden, to the loosened soil, to how nothing had changed on the surface, yet everything underneath was different. That was what these choices felt like, preparation rather than performance. That night, she slept deeply, waking only once, and falling back asleep without the usual restlessness. In the morning, she noticed her thoughts felt clearer, her movements slightly easier, not dramatically, just enough to matter. She didn't write these observations down. She didn't label them as success. She simply noticed, and noticing felt like enough. A quiet reflection surfaced as she made her coffee, the steam rising gently between her hands. Big changes are rarely built from big decisions. They're built from small ones repeated kindly. Maggie took a sip and looked out the window, feeling something that resembled trust begin to return. Not in a program or a promise, but in her own ability to pay attention and respond. Have you ever noticed how choosing a little differently can open unexpected space? Dinner tasted different when she stopped rushing it. The house was quiet by the time Maggie set the table. No television murmuring in the background, no phone buzzing nearby. Just the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of the refrigerator. She lit the small candle she usually saved for company and smiled at herself. Tonight, It felt like enough. She sat down and took a breath before lifting her fork. It was such a simple thing, pausing before a meal, yet it felt unfamiliar. For years, dinner had been something to get through, eaten standing up, interrupted, folded into the end of an already long day. Tonight, she let it be an event, however small. The first bite surprised her. The flavors felt clearer, more distinct. Not richer, just present. She chewed slowly, noticing how her body responded, how the tension in her shoulders eased with each unhurried breath. According to many studies, digestion begins before food even reaches the stomach, influenced by how calm or hurried a person feels. Maggie didn't know the science behind it. She just knew that something about slowing down made the meal feel easier, lighter. Halfway through, she set her fork down. Not because she was full, but because she wanted to check in. The heaviness she'd been expecting didn't arrive. Instead, there was a quiet sense of balance, like everything was moving along without resistance. She thought about all the time she'd eaten while distracted, barely tasting the food. It wasn't a failing, it was a habit built during years when time felt scarce and efficiency felt necessary. Her body had adapted to that pace, just as it had adapted to everything else. Now, it seemed to be responding to the invitation to slow down. After dinner, she didn't immediately stand to clear the table. She stayed seated, hands resting in her lap, candle flickering gently. She felt satisfied in a way that went beyond the meal, a sense of completion that didn't usually show up until much later in the evening. Many people notice that comfort after eating changes when they adjust not what they eat but how they eat. Maggie found that thought reassuring. It meant there was room to improve without perfection, space to experiment without pressure. She washed the dishes slowly, the warm water soothing against her hands. The sink filled, then emptied, just as it always did. This time, though, she noticed how her body felt afterward, lighter, less encumbered. The familiar tightness in her midsection never appeared. Later, curled up on the couch with a book, she realized she wasn't reaching for snacks out of restlessness. Her body felt settled, her mind calmer. The urge simply wasn't there. A quiet reflection surfaced as she turned a page. Maybe the body doesn't crave more food. Maybe it craves more attention. That night, as she prepared for bed, Maggie felt a subtle gratitude for the ordinariness of the evening. No breakthroughs. No dramatic shifts. Just a meal that landed differently than it used to. She turned off the light, feeling comfortable, not heavy, and let sleep arrive without resistance. Sometimes, she realized, the smallest changes, like how you sit at the table, can ripple through the rest of the night. Have you ever noticed how slowing down can change the way your body responds? The notebook had a single word on the page. Pause. Well. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight spilling across the page. Her notebook, the one she had slowly filled with observations, thoughts, and quiet reflections, lay open in front of her. Today, only one word stared back. Pause. She traced it with her finger, letting it sink in, not rushing past it. It wasn't that she had forgotten to write. It was that her body had reminded her in its subtle, insistent way. She felt the stiffness in her shoulders, the slight heaviness in her legs, and the lingering fullness from breakfast. Nothing alarming, just signals she had learned to notice. Pause. The previous weeks had taught her that small interruptions in routine could be powerful. A walk at a slower pace. A meal eaten with attention. A garden tended carefully instead of hurriedly. She had been practicing pause without calling it by name. Now, seeing the word written, she felt the gentle nudge to honor it consciously. According to many studies, the nervous system responds to brief, intentional breaks in activity. Even a minute or two can help digestion, energy flow, and mental clarity. Maggie didn't think of it as research. She thought of it as courtesy to herself. She leaned back in her chair and sipped her tea, noticing how warm it felt against her hands. The steam curled upward, soft and delicate, like a visible sigh. She realized she had been living life almost entirely forward. Always moving, always doing. Her body had tolerated it, but now it was asking for a rhythm she had almost forgotten. The pause extended naturally into her morning. She watered the plants on the windowsill, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, feeling the morning sunlight warm her face. She noticed the veins in the leaves, the tiny curl at the edges of new growth, the way the soil smelled after a light watering. Ordinary things, but with attention, they became anchors. Later, she prepared lunch with the same care, chopping vegetables slowly, appreciating textures and colors she usually missed. Eating at the table, she focused on flavors, textures, and the sensation of fullness. There was no rush, no need to finish. She simply let the meal arrive in her awareness. Many people notice that cultivating pauses, however small, can influence overall wellness in ways that don't appear on a chart. Maggie felt it physically, a lightness in her stomach, a quieting in her mind, a softening of tension she hadn't realized she carried. In the afternoon, she sat by the window with her notebook again. Not to write obligations, not to plan, not to list tasks, just to reflect. A thought surfaced, almost like a whisper. The body responds to attention, not force. She smiled. That was simple, but profound. It reframed the way she viewed movement, meals, rest, and even her daily routines. She didn't have to overhaul her life to feel better. She only had to notice, only had to pause. As evening approached, Maggie prepared a light dinner, lit a candle again, and let herself linger at the table longer than usual. She felt gratitude for the ordinary act of eating slowly, noticing her surroundings, and giving herself permission to move gently through the day. The night came quietly. She settled into bed and reflected that wellness doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in subtle rhythms, small acknowledgments, and the simple act of slowing down. Have you ever noticed how taking a moment to pause can change the way your whole day feels? Her favorite mug trembled slightly in her hand. Maggie held her morning coffee, sitting at the counter as the sun rose. The steam curled in delicate spirals, warming her fingers. She noticed the tiny tremor in her hand, small enough that no one else would see it, but enough to make her pause. She took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the mug anchor her, feeling the pulse of life beneath her skin. It was an ordinary moment, yet it carried quiet significance. For weeks, she had been paying attention to these small signals, the subtle messages her body had been sending her all along. Not warnings, not alarms, just gentle hints. Today, the tremor reminded her that care wasn't just about grand routines, it was about noticing the details. According to many studies, minor changes in dexterity or movement can be influenced by fatigue, nutrition, or simply lack of attention to rest. Maggie didn't think of this as a diagnosis. She thought of it as feedback, information to guide how she moved, how she rested, how she nourished herself. She set the mug down and stretched her arms slowly. The sunlight fell across the kitchen, highlighting the small scratches in the counter, the chipped edge of a plate, the crumbs from breakfast still clinging to the table. Life was imperfect, lived in layers, but these details reminded her of continuity. She was here. She was present. Later, she prepared a simple breakfast, focusing on each action, cracking the eggs, whisking gently, feeling the rhythm of motion. She noticed how her hands worked together, coordinating, balancing, responding. Movement felt different when it was intentional, not rushed. As she ate, she reflected on past mornings when she had moved mechanically, ignoring signals, rushing from one task to the next. Her body had tolerated it, but quietly, patiently, it had been asking for acknowledgement. She realized now that the tremor wasn't a problem. It was a messenger. That afternoon, Maggie walked slowly through the neighborhood, stopping to smell flowers, watch a bird hop along a fence, and admire the way sunlight painted patterns on the sidewalk. She paid attention to how her arms moved, how her legs carried her, how her breath flowed steadily. Each motion felt deliberate, restorative. Many people notice that small, mindful actions compound over time. Maggie felt it now, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual alignment of body and awareness. Her energy felt steadier, her mind quieter, her steps lighter. Back home, she returned to her notebook and wrote one word at the top of the page: notice. She added a few lines about how attention transforms the ordinary, how slowing down allows the body to respond more fully, how small observations can ripple outward into daily life. As evening fell, Maggie lit a candle again, sipping her tea, feeling grounded. She reflected on the tiny tremor that had started her day, grateful for the reminder that wellness isn't always dramatic. Often, It comes in whispers, small signals, subtle encouragements to adjust, listen, and care. Have you ever noticed how paying attention to small details can change the way your body and mind feel? The sunlight caught the corner of her running shoes, and she smiled. Maggie laced up her sneakers, the worn fabric soft against her fingers. She hadn't expected today to feel different, not really. But as she stepped outside, the crisp morning air filled her lungs, and she noticed something subtle yet undeniable, a spring in her step. Not a grand transformation, not a rush of energy, just a quiet lightness she hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood was waking slowly. Mailboxes glinted in the sun. A dog barked in the distance. She adjusted her pace, letting her legs find their rhythm. Her heart beat steadily, comfortably, as if reminding her that it had been capable all along. It simply needed patience, attention, and gentle care to remember. According to many studies, small, consistent improvements in movement, nutrition, and attention to the body's signals can compound over time, producing meaningful changes in endurance, balance, and overall energy. Maggie didn't think in terms of numbers or tests. She thought in terms of sensation, her feet moving freely, her lungs opening fully, her mind calm and present. She ran past the familiar houses, the crooked maple tree, the blue house with the wind chimes. Everything seemed the same, and yet, for her, it was new. Each step carried a quiet triumph. The garden she had tended, the meals she had slowed down to enjoy, the pauses she had allowed herself, all of it had contributed to this unremarkable, yet extraordinary moment. She slowed to a walk near the end of the block, catching her breath, feeling her heartbeat gradually settle. A neighbor waved from their porch, and she waved back, smiling. There was gratitude in the ordinary gestures, in the small movements, in the body's responsiveness. Maggie remembered the early mornings with coffee, the notebook with words like pause and notice, the walks taken with intention. She realized that transformation wasn't about dramatic cures or overnight fixes. It was about accumulation, tiny choices repeated, attention paid, respect given to the quiet signals the body sends every day. Later, she cooled down on the porch, water bottle in hand. She thought about how the journey had begun, not with running shoes or ambitious goals, but with noticing, listening, and responding. A light breeze moved through the trees, and she felt the subtle expansion of possibility in her chest. Many people notice that wellness often shows up in small, cumulative ways rather than sudden breakthroughs. Maggie felt that now, fully present, fully aware, fully alive in the simplicity of movement and attention. She sipped her water, reflecting that caring for herself didn't require perfection. It required observation, patience, and the courage to act on what she noticed. Small actions had shifted everything, not overnight, not magically, but steadily, faithfully, with consistency and kindness. Have you ever noticed how small, gentle choices can accumulate into something remarkable over time? The kettle whistled before she even reached the kitchen. Maggie poured hot water into her favorite mug, letting the steam curl around her hands. She paused to inhale, savoring the warmth, the faint scent of herbal tea, the quiet that filled the morning. She realized how often she had rushed through these small rituals, coffee gulped on the run, breakfast eaten while scanning emails, the world moving faster than her attention could follow. Today was different. Today, she allowed herself to linger. She settled into her chair near the window, the sunlight falling across the page of her notebook. Her fingers traced the words she had written the night before. Notice, pause, attend. They felt less like instructions and more like companions, gentle reminders to honor herself in each action. According to many studies, mindful routines, even small ones, help the body regulate energy, mood, and digestion. Maggie didn't think of it in technical terms. She thought of it as reclaiming moments for herself, moments that had quietly slipped away in the rush of everyday life. She sipped her tea slowly, noticing the warmth travel from her mouth to her chest. The hum of the neighborhood rose gently outside the window. A car door, birds hopping on the fence, the faint murmur of conversation. Life was happening, and she felt present within it rather than carried along by it. Later, she moved through her morning chores deliberately, folding laundry, watering plants, checking the mailbox. Each act felt layered with intention. Maggie had discovered that attention transforms the ordinary into meaningful practice. Washing dishes could be meditative. Walking down the street could be restorative. Even the smallest choice mattered. Halfway through the day, she took a brief walk to the corner store. She noticed the rhythm of her steps, the subtle engagement of her muscles, the gentle coordination of breath and movement. A neighbor called hello, and she responded with a smile that reached her eyes. Small interactions had a way of knitting her into the world, a quiet reminder that vitality was both internal and relational. Many people notice that the combination of attention, gentle activity, and mindful pauses can create a feedback loop of energy and satisfaction. Maggie had begun to experience that firsthand. Each conscious action reinforced the next, building subtle momentum that didn't announce itself but quietly strengthened her well-being. Returning home, she brewed another cup of tea and sat on the porch. A breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the faint scent of flowers from a neighbor's garden. She watched shadows lengthen across the yard, feeling the soft satisfaction of completing a day attended to with awareness. A quiet thought surfaced, mingling with the steam from her mug. Wellness isn't a destination. It's the accumulation of attention, care, and kindness over time. She let herself sit a while longer, knowing she didn't need to rush. She didn't need to achieve or prove anything. She only needed to notice, respond, and allow herself to exist fully in these moments. Have you ever noticed how simply attending to small moments can shift the feeling of your entire day? The porch swing creaked under her weight, a familiar welcome. Maggie sank into the old wooden swing, letting it sway gently with the rhythm of her breathing. She had always loved this porch, the way sunlight dappled through the oak tree, how the wind carried the scent of neighboring gardens. Today, though, she noticed it more keenly, not as background, but as presence. Every sound, every scent, every slight movement seemed sharper, more vivid. She reflected on how her awareness had shifted over the past months. Once, she would have sat here scrolling through her phone, half present, half absorbed in another world. Now, she simply allowed herself to be, to notice the swing's creak, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the subtle movement of clouds across the sky. According to many studies, mindfulness and sensory awareness can enhance emotional well-being and reduce tension, particularly in older adults. Maggie didn't need studies to feel the truth. She felt it in her shoulders, no longer tight and braced. She felt it in her legs, relaxed yet responsive. She felt it in her chest, a gentle openness that hadn't been there before. As the swing carried her back and forth, she let her mind wander. She thought about small choices, the garden she tended, the meals she slowed down to enjoy, the walks she had taken with attention. Each one had added a layer of ease to her days, an accumulation of care that manifested now as calm presence. A neighbor's dog barked nearby, and she smiled at its enthusiasm. The sound didn't startle her or pull her from the moment. Instead, it felt like a companion in this quiet morning, a reminder that life was happening outside and inside her at the same time. Later, Maggie moved indoors and prepared a simple lunch. She chopped vegetables deliberately, noticing the colors, textures, and smells. Eating slowly, she paid attention to how each bite felt, savoring flavors and textures often overlooked in haste. This attentiveness didn't feel like work. It felt restorative, almost celebratory in its simplicity. Many people notice that attending to ordinary moments, meals, movement, rest, creates subtle but meaningful shifts in energy, mood, and satisfaction. Maggie felt it now, not as a theory, but as lived experience. Her body moved fluidly, her mind was calm, and even her thoughts seemed less cluttered. That afternoon, she returned to her swing, tea in hand. The sunlight had shifted, casting long patterns across the porch floor. She watched shadows play, listened to the quiet stir of leaves, and felt a gentle alignment settle within her. Life didn't have to be dramatic to be beautiful. Attention and care, small and steady, were enough. A quiet reflection surfaced. The ordinary, when truly noticed, can become extraordinary. She sipped her tea and let the swing carry her slowly back and forth, a simple, faithful rhythm. It reminded her that wellness wasn't a destination or a dramatic revelation. It was the sum of small acts of presence, patience, and self-kindness repeated day after day. Have you ever noticed how slowing down to truly experience a simple moment can transform the way you feel? The garden hose coiled like a sleeping snake at her feet. Maggie knelt on the soft earth, untangling the hose and letting the sunlight warm her back. She had spent the morning tending to her vegetable beds, and now, as she watered the plants slowly, she noticed every droplet sliding down leaves and soaking into the soil. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet satisfaction in seeing the water move where it was needed. She remembered past summers, rushing through chores, glancing at the clock, always thinking about the next task. Today, she was present. She was not racing, not multitasking. The soil, the plants, and even the sun itself seemed to invite her into a slower, more attentive way of being. According to many studies, gentle, consistent physical activity, especially when paired with mindfulness, supports circulation, joint mobility, and mental well-being. Maggie didn't think about studies. She thought about the pleasure of feeling her hands work, the stretch in her arms, the movement of her legs as she shifted position. Her body responded, not out of obligation, but because it was acknowledged and cared for. As she finished watering, Maggie stood and brushed dirt from her knees. She felt a subtle ease in her spine, a softness in her shoulders. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden surge of energy. It was quiet, cumulative, like the soil absorbing each drop of water over time. Later, she harvested a few tomatoes, their skins warm from the sun. She admired their color, the firmness in her hands, the scent that reminded her of childhood summers. She felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with productivity. It was simply the satisfaction of care, attention, and presence. Many people notice that integrating small, consistent movements into daily routines, gardening, walking, stretching, can ripple outward into other aspects of life. Maggie felt it now. A quiet confidence, steadiness in her steps, and a calmness in her thoughts that had been elusive before. In the evening, she carried a basket of vegetables to the kitchen and prepared a light, simple dinner. She chopped slowly, noticed flavors, and ate attentively. Each bite felt like a small celebration of the work she had done and the life she had cultivated. A soft reflection arose as she washed her hands. Caring for life, plants, body, or mind requires attention, patience, and consistency, not urgency or perfection. She stepped onto the porch with her tea, letting the evening air settle around her. The garden glowed softly in the fading sunlight. She felt the steady satisfaction of a day attended to fully, of small actions accumulated, and of her body moving in harmony with intention and awareness. Have you ever noticed how tending to small things can create a quiet sense of strength and balance in your life? The mailbox flag clanged, startling her into the morning calm. Maggie walked slowly down the driveway, squinting against the early sunlight, her hands tucked loosely into the pockets of her cardigan. The mail had arrived, a small bundle of letters, advertisements, and a familiar magazine subscription. She bent down to pick it up, noticing the weight of it in her hands, and for a moment she simply lingered. The movement of bending, lifting, and straightening was nothing extraordinary, yet it carried a subtle, grounding satisfaction she hadn't acknowledged in years. For a long time, Maggie had moved through her days with efficiency as her guide. Each action was planned, timed, and executed to meet some invisible standard. She rarely paused to feel the motion of her limbs, the way her breath shifted with effort, or the small victories hidden in ordinary routines. Now, each simple movement carried the quiet weight of awareness, a gentle acknowledgement that her body was capable, that it responded, that it mattered. She walked back inside, placing the mail on the counter, and lingered to watch sunlight spill across the kitchen floor. The warm glow highlighted imperfections she might have ignored before the faint scratch where a plate had slipped years ago. The tiny chip in the edge of the counter, the uneven floorboards that creaked underfoot, each imperfection seemed to tell a story of care, resilience, and continuity. She smiled. Life was messy, unpolished, but full. Later, she prepared a breakfast that was as deliberate as it was nourishing. Eggs whisked with care, toast buttered slowly, a sprinkle of salt considered, not rushed. Maggie noticed the subtle sensations in her body as she worked. The stretch in her arms, the firmness of her stance, the smooth rotation of her wrists. Movement, when attended to, carried its own kind of pleasure, a reminder that her body had been listening all along, waiting for recognition rather than force. According to many studies, small, mindful routines of daily activity improve circulation, digestion, balance, and mental clarity, particularly in older adults. Maggie didn't need research to validate her experience. She felt it in the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, the ease of her joints, and the gentle alignment of posture she had nearly forgotten existed. After breakfast, she decided to tackle a small corner of her garden that had been neglected for weeks. The soil was dense, stubborn in some patches, and she worked it gently, turning it over with care rather than force. As she dug, watered, and planted, she felt an intimate connection between action and result. The soil loosened gradually, the tiny seeds nestled comfortably, and she recognized the same principle mirrored in her own life. Progress comes not from speed or intensity, but from patient, steady attention. Her mind wandered as her hands worked. She thought about the countless mornings she had skipped slow breakfasts, the years she had ignored subtle aches or signals, the routines she had completed on autopilot. And now, she realized, the smallest acts, the mindful bending to pick up the mail, the deliberate placement of each seed, the attention to posture while moving were quietly transforming her energy, her ease, and her confidence. Later in the afternoon, Maggie paused on her porch with a cup of tea, sunlight fading gently toward evening. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to notice everything: the warm breeze brushing her skin, the distant laughter of children, the subtle aroma of soil and flowers from her garden. Her chest felt open, her mind unhurried, and her body settled in a way that felt like homecoming. Many people notice that when attention is given to small, ordinary movements, when awareness is combined with gentle action, it builds momentum. That momentum doesn't shout, it whispers. It manifests in steadier steps, calmer thoughts, more energy, and a subtle resilience that no sudden effort can replicate. Maggie felt it now, fully embodied, in every inch of her being. As evening drew in, she prepared a modest dinner, noting each texture, taste, and scent with quiet appreciation. She ate slowly, savoring the interplay of flavors, the warmth of the meal, the simple satisfaction of nourishment. She reflected that care is not always dramatic, not always obvious, but it is cumulative. Small, repeated attentions, whether to body, mind, or surroundings, gradually shape a life that feels lighter, fuller, and more present. A soft observation surfaced as she washed her hands afterward. Every small, deliberate choice is a conversation with yourself, a reminder that life and body respond when noticed, honored, and respected. She lingered on the porch a little longer, watching shadows lengthen across the yard, breathing in the scent of evening air mixed with faint floral hints from nearby gardens. She felt gratitude not just for the day, but for the slow accumulation of awareness, attention, and gentle care that had made her feel more capable, more present, and more alive than she had in years. Have you ever noticed how attending to the smallest routines can ripple through your entire day, reshaping how you feel and move? The old clock ticked louder than usual, marking the quiet of the morning. Maggie stood in her living room, stretching her arms slowly toward the ceiling. The light from the east-facing window painted soft stripes across the carpet, and the faint scent of last night's rain clung to the air. She paused for a moment, listening to the tick of the old clock on the wall. It was loud, steady, almost insistently reminding her that time moves, even when we barely notice it. She smiled, appreciating the rhythm. Time could feel like pressure, but it could also feel like companionship when she slowed down enough to notice it. Over the past months, Maggie had learned to pay attention to small signals from her body and her surroundings. She had practiced slowing down, pausing, and responding with gentle care. These changes were subtle, often invisible to anyone but herself, yet she could feel them in the way her shoulders moved more freely, her joints carried her without protest, and her mind held thoughts with less clutter and more clarity. This morning, she decided to tackle a task she had avoided for weeks: organizing her kitchen cabinets. It was not a huge project, just a space that had gradually become cluttered with mismatched mugs, old spices, and random utensils. Maggie approached it slowly, pulling out one item at a time, feeling the texture, noticing remembering where she had first bought it or how it had come into her life. She placed some items aside, keeping only what was functional or meaningful. The process felt meditative. She realized that attention could transform even chores into a kind of nourishment, feeding the mind and spirit as much as the body. According to many studies, mindful, intentional engagement in everyday tasks supports cognitive health, emotional well-being, and even physical coordination. Maggie didn't need studies to feel the effects. She noticed in real time how her hands moved with purpose, how her spine responded to bending and stretching, and how her mind stayed focused without fatigue or frustration. After the cabinets were sorted, she brewed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, her notebook open beside her. She scribbled reflections on the day, observations about how mindful movement and attention to ordinary tasks helped her feel steadier, more capable, and more at peace. She noted small triumphs, the way the sun illuminated her favorite mug, the softness of the rug under her feet, the satisfaction of an organized shelf. These were not grand achievements, but together, they created a cumulative sense of well-being she hadn't known she was capable of experiencing. Later, Maggie ventured outside for a walk in the neighborhood. She chose a familiar route, the one lined with maples and oaks, their leaves beginning to shift with the first hints of fall. As she walked, she paid attention to her posture, the way her feet landed lightly on the sidewalk, the rhythm of her breathing, and the subtle engagement of muscles she hadn't consciously noticed in years. A gentle wind brushed her hair across her cheeks, and she smiled, feeling her body and mind working in harmony. Along the way, she noticed small details she would have missed in her previous, hurried walks. The delicate curve of a bird's wing in flight, the patterned bark of an old tree, the glint of sunlight on a neighbor's window. Each observation added layers to her sense of presence, reinforcing a quiet joy in everyday life. Maggie realized that life's richness didn't only come from extraordinary moments, it often appeared in the accumulation of small, intentional attentions repeated over time. Back home, she prepared a light, wholesome lunch. She chopped vegetables deliberately, noticing textures, colors, and scents. As she ate slowly, she reflected on how these small rituals, meals, walks, chores, mindfulness, were gradually weaving themselves into a new pattern of living. Her body felt lighter, more responsive, and her mind clearer. She realized that the subtle improvements she felt weren't dramatic or sudden, but cumulative, a mosaic of care that made her feel stronger, steadier, and more present in each moment. Later in the afternoon, she returned to her garden. The soil felt soft under her fingers, the plants responded to gentle attention, and the sun warmed her skin in comfortable patches. She moved deliberately, noticing the strength in her legs and the flexibility in her arms. Each movement reminded her that her body was responsive, capable, and deserving of care. Even small acts, watering a plant, turning soil, trimming leaves, felt restorative, connecting her to the world in a tangible, grounding way. Many people notice that consistent, gentle attention to the body, mind, and environment accumulates into deeper vitality, calmness, and resilience. Maggie felt this in every step, every breath, every motion. She realized that wellness wasn't built through extremes or sudden transformations, but through steady, mindful engagement with life. As the evening descended, Maggie sat on her porch, tea in hand, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of life beyond her yard. The shadows lengthened, painting the garden in muted golds and greens. She reflected on the day, the quiet triumphs, the small attentions, the deliberate choices, and felt a sense of contentment that was both deep and subtle. Her body, mind, and spirit seemed aligned in a gentle rhythm that reassured her she was moving forward, not by leaps, but by conscious, steady steps. A soft reflection arose as she set her cup down. Life is less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about small, deliberate acts of care, repeated day after day. That is where true vitality grows. Have you ever noticed how consistent, mindful attention to ordinary moments can quietly transform your energy, your body, and your sense of presence? The hum of the refrigerator sounded almost musical in the quiet kitchen. Maggie moved slowly through her kitchen, gathering ingredients for a simple lunch. The sunlight streamed in through the window, highlighting the small imperfections in the countertop, tiny scratches and stains that told stories of meals past. She paused to run her fingers over the surface, remembering her children's hands leaving marks decades ago, the laughter that had accompanied hurried breakfasts, and the quiet moments of reflection over solitary cups of tea. Every mark seemed alive with memory, a gentle reminder that life, like her countertop, bore the traces of care, attention, and passage of time. She chopped vegetables deliberately, feeling the weight of the knife, the resistance of the carrots, the crispness of the bell pepper. The sound of chopping was rhythmic, almost meditative, each slice connecting her hands to the present moment. She realized that she had rarely allowed herself to notice these ordinary acts with full attention. In the past, they had been chores to get through. Now, they were a practice in awareness, grounding her in her body and surroundings. According to many studies, paying deliberate attention to daily routines, cooking, cleaning, walking enhances both physical and cognitive health. Maggie didn't need numbers or research to understand it. She felt the subtle coordination of her muscles, the alignment of her posture, and the calm clarity of her mind. Each small act reinforced a sense of self-care that had been dormant for years. After finishing her lunch, Maggie washed the dishes slowly, noticing the warm water on her hands, the scent of soap, the reflection of sunlight and the droplets clinging to each plate. She paused between movements, letting her breath settle, allowing herself to feel the gentle rhythm of doing and being. These small pauses, she realized, were as nourishing as the meal itself. Later, she decided to go for a short walk through her neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and distant pine. She noticed her footsteps, the subtle movement of her legs, the engagement of muscles she often took for granted. Each step felt intentional, deliberate, almost celebratory. She smiled at a neighbor watering their garden and received a warm wave in return. The simple human interaction amplified her sense of connection to the world around her. Maggie reflected on how far she had come. Months ago, she might have hurried through these routines, ignoring signals from her body, letting small aches and stiffness accumulate. Now, with deliberate attention, she felt the difference in her posture, her energy, and her mood. The body, she realized, responds to attention and care, not to force or alarm. Even minor movements, when repeated with awareness, could accumulate into meaningful shifts in vitality. Back home, Maggie spent time with her notebook. She wrote observations about her day, the textures she noticed, the warmth of the sun, the gentle hum of life around her. She recorded small victories, feeling lighter when walking, clarity of thought, and the subtle satisfaction of completing tasks with attention. Writing had become a mirror for her daily practices, reflecting growth and change she might otherwise overlook. As the afternoon deepened into evening, Maggie prepared a cup of herbal tea and sat on her porch. The sky was painted in shades of gold and violet, and the wind stirred the trees gently. She listened to the faint rustle of leaves, felt the warmth of the mug in her hands, and allowed herself to simply breathe. Her body felt responsive, her mind quiet, and her spirit anchored in the rhythm of the day. Many people notice that when mindfulness, attention, and gentle physical activity are woven into daily life, subtle but profound transformations occur. Maggie felt this vividly. Steadier steps, easier movement, calmer thoughts, and a persistent sense of presence. The cumulative effect of small, conscious actions was creating a foundation of well-being she had never experienced before. A quiet thought surfaced as she watched shadows lengthen across the garden. Life doesn't demand dramatic gestures for transformation. It whispers through attention, intention, and the care we give to small, ordinary moments. She lingered on the porch, tea in hand, savoring the gentle rhythm of evening settling in. The world was moving, changing, yet she felt firmly present, rooted in a pattern of care, observation, and mindful movement that had become a steady companion. Have you ever noticed how fully attending to simple, everyday acts can quietly ripple into a stronger, calmer, and more energized self? The screen of her old tablet glowed softly, casting a warm light across the living room. Maggie sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling slowly through her notes and articles about wellness and daily routines. The soft hum of her tablet filled the quiet room, and she realized how different this moment felt compared to a year ago. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't scanning absent-mindedly, she was here, fully engaged, noticing each detail, each word, each sensation of her fingers moving across the smooth screen. It struck her that presence could be cultivated even in ordinary, modern tasks. She reflected on her mornings, the walks, the garden chores, the mindful meals. Each seemingly mundane act had slowly built a rhythm of attention and care. She remembered the tremor in her hands months ago, the subtle fatigue that had crept into her days, the times she had ignored small aches. None of those moments were dramatic, they were quiet nudges. And yet, in retrospect, she realized that responding to those nudges, paying attention to them gently, had changed everything. According to many studies, consistent small practices of mindfulness, light physical activity, and conscious engagement with daily life can improve balance, circulation, mood, and cognitive sharpness in older adults. Maggie didn't dwell on the science. She felt it. She felt the alignment of her posture, the steadiness in her steps, the calm in her mind, and the light energy moving through her body. The proof was in her lived experience. After putting her tablet aside, Maggie decided to take a longer walk than usual, venturing into a nearby park she had rarely visited. The path was lined with tall oaks and maples, their leaves whispering in the late morning breeze. She felt the subtle stretch in her legs, the rotation in her hips, and the lightness in her chest as she moved. The effort wasn't strenuous, but it was attentive, and that attention amplified the effect. Every step became a dialogue between her body and the world around her, a negotiation of balance, strength, and awareness. Along the path, she paused to watch a squirrel navigating the branches of a tree. Its agility and careful planning reminded her that movement was more than physical, it was coordination, attention, awareness. She smiled, realizing that this small observation mirrored her own journey. She too had learned to navigate life more mindfully, with attention and care guiding her movements. Later, she stopped at a bench, taking in the colors of the park, the green of leaves starting to fade, the orange of early fall, the muted brown of the earth. She closed her eyes and felt the rhythm of her breath, the subtle pulse in her veins, the steady support of her muscles. Movement, mindfulness, and care had become interwoven, creating a sense of vitality that she hadn't known she could feel so consistently. Returning home, Maggie prepared a simple afternoon snack. She sliced fruit carefully, noticing texture, color, and scent. Each bite was deliberate, savored. She reflected on the quiet transformation of her energy, mood, and presence, how small, consistent practices, repeated over weeks and months, had added up to something remarkable. Not dramatic, not instant, but cumulative and sustainable. She then sat with her notebook, writing reflections on her journey. She noted that wellness wasn't about extreme measures or sudden fixes, it was about noticing, listening, and responding to small signals every day. Even tiny moments, breathing deeply, stretching gently, paying attention to posture, savoring food. Noticing the world around her had contributed to a foundation of strength, balance, and clarity. As evening approached, Maggie moved to her porch with a cup of tea. The sky glowed with muted orange and pink, and the wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. She let herself simply sit, appreciating the culmination of small, steady choices that had led her here. Present, attentive, alive, and capable. The quiet joy of ordinary moments, when fully noticed, had become her new vitality. Many people notice that long-term engagement with small, mindful practices creates profound effects on energy, mobility, and mental clarity. Maggie felt it in her body, in her breath, and in the ease with which she moved and thought. This wasn't a sudden transformation, it was a tapestry woven from patience, attention, and gentle care. A soft reflection came to her. Life grows richer, not through leaps or sudden fixes, but through consistent, mindful attention to the ordinary and often overlooked moments that shape us daily. Have you ever noticed how repeated, gentle attention to your daily actions can quietly transform your energy, your mind, and your sense of presence over time? The evening sky glimmered with the first stars, casting a gentle glow over her backyard. Maggie sat on her porch swing, wrapped in a soft shawl, letting the cool night air brush against her skin. The gentle rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, and the faint hum of traffic from the street beyond created a soothing symphony that filled the quiet moments. She sipped her tea slowly, noticing the warmth in her hands, the aroma rising from the cup, and the way her body relaxed into the swing. For the first time in years, she felt a profound sense of harmony, not just in her surroundings, but in herself. Looking back over the months, Maggie realized how much her life had transformed through small, deliberate practices. The walks in the park, the mindful meals, the gentle stretches, the attention to daily chores, and the quiet moments of reflection had gradually woven themselves into a rhythm of life that felt alive, responsive, and sustaining. She thought about the days when her body had felt stiff, her energy low, her mind cluttered. She had faced those moments, not with drastic measures, but with curiosity, care, and consistency. Slowly, quietly, she had built a foundation for vitality and presence. According to many studies, consistent engagement in mindful movement, intentional attention to daily activities, and small, regular acts of self-care can significantly improve physical coordination, mental clarity, and emotional well-being in seniors. Maggie didn't need statistics to recognize the truth in her own experience. She felt it in the spring of her step, the steadiness of her posture, the ease of her breath, and the calm clarity of her thoughts. As she watched the stars twinkle above, Maggie reflected on the ordinary moments that had become extraordinary through attention and care. She remembered the mornings spent in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with care, the afternoons in the garden, feeling the soil between her fingers, the walks through neighborhoods and parks, noticing every leaf, every sound, every subtle motion of life around her. Each moment, simple and unassuming, had contributed to a cumulative transformation of her body, mind, and spirit. Later, she moved indoors to her cozy reading nook, a blanket draped over her lap. She opened a notebook and began to write, not to document progress, but to honor the journey she had taken. She wrote about noticing the small victories, the ease of bending without pain, the steadiness of her steps, the alertness of her mind, the calm joy of simply existing fully in each moment. She wrote about how ordinary routines, when attended to with mindfulness, patience, and gentle care, had created a ripple effect that touched every aspect of her life. Maggie paused, pen hovering above the paper, and reflected on the philosophy that had quietly emerged over these months. Wellness is not a race, a sudden fix, or an extreme effort. It is a mosaic of attention, repeated small actions, awareness, and kindness to oneself. Each mindful act, watering a plant, savoring a meal, stretching, walking, breathing, was a thread in a larger tapestry of vitality. Over time, the tapestry became stronger, more vibrant, more supportive. As night deepened, Maggie returned to the porch swing, tea in hand. The stars sparkled brighter, mirrored by the quiet twinkle of lights from nearby houses. She breathed deeply, feeling the gentle expansion of her chest, the subtle responsiveness of her muscles, and the peaceful rhythm of her mind. She thought about how far she had come, not in leaps, but in steady, deliberate steps. The journey had been gradual, almost imperceptible at times, yet the results were undeniable. Her body moved with greater ease, her energy was steadier, and her mind was clearer. Life, she realized, was richer because of the care she had taken, the attention she had offered, and the patience she had cultivated. Many people noticed that long-term, mindful engagement in small, consistent actions creates deep, sustainable improvements in physical, mental, and emotional health. Maggie could feel it in every fiber of her being, the calm confidence in her movements, the clarity in her thoughts, and the warm steadiness in her heart. Wellness, she had discovered, was less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about the quiet accumulation of daily attentions and conscious choices. She looked up at the sky and whispered to herself, "True vitality grows not in leaps or extremes, but in the careful tending of ordinary moments, repeated day by day with awareness and care." The night wrapped around her like a soft blanket. She stayed on the swing, letting the silence and the stars remind her of the rhythm she had built, a rhythm of presence, of care, of gentle empowerment that made her feel alive, capable, and connected to the world in a way she had never felt before. Have you ever noticed how consistent, mindful attention to ordinary moments can culminate in a deep sense of strength, vitality, and presence that transforms everyday life?